My name's Evan. I'm going to be talking about some work I did for my master's project, which is here in Edinburgh with Britain. And it's about, well, it basically boils down to answering this question of does varying metallicity change the ion fraction in the circumgalactic medium? Which basically boils down to another question of is it okay just to assume solar metallicity things? Some disclaimers is that this was 2 years ago that I finished this project. And I don't really remember all of the details. So if you start asking me very specific questions, I'll probably just say I don't know. Varying metallicity has kind of two meanings. One is like if you have like your simulation and you have your metallicity in there, just the total amount of, say, oxygen. That's obviously already accounted for. What I'm talking about is how you typically have like a lookup table that you generate with some cloudy data, and if you change the metallicity there, that's going to change your atomic physics that goes into everything. It's kind of the subgrid model that you're changing. I care, and because if you want to get, you have your simulation and you want to be able to extract observables from that, you need to have your ion fraction correct, because that is then what goes into any kind of absorption feature you would have in the spectrum. And I'm gonna avoid talking too much about like the science and talk more about the of how I use YT in this. I think I'll say why. Is you kind of have two sides to a lot of projects. I think kind of master's projects especially, where you have machinery, so you kind of build something, and the science side, so you build something to answer a question. And you normally don't get to talk about the machinery that much. So these last two bullet points, right, of adding 4D interpolation to YT, adding metallicity interpolation to Trident, that is a paragraph in my thesis. And that took me, the right-hand side here took me 5 months. Sorry, the left-hand side took me 5 months. And then you just get to do like the nice pre-science stuff. So I'm going to mainly talk about the left-hand side here. So what we did, we have like the call stack here of you as a user. We'll call so I should say Trident is like a YT extension. It generates synthetic spectra. So when you want to use it, you will call this add ion fraction field. Takes in this user specified interpolation table that previously did not have a metallicity axis. We added that in, and then it calls the DS add field to add in all these new fields you're interested in. To call that, it calls its own ion fraction field. So you might remember when we were talking about add field, then that calls a YT quadrilinear field interpolator, which is how YT itself takes its named field data and does interpolation on that. And that itself then calls this other interpolating function, which just takes any arrays. And I've never actually got to tell anyone, I think me and Britain are the only people that have ever spoken about this. Then, all the visualization came out of YT. So a lot of projection plots for different averages, and also column densities, which I'll talk about. Show you some of the we have here, yeah. And so column density we're interested in. If you imagine you are taking a spectrum, a line of sight through something, you can only measure how much is kind of along that. So, you can't say, oh, there's a cloud there and a cloud there. Really, you can only say how much is there between the two of us. And when you take like a projection plot like this, that gives you, a bunch of pixels with these things. So, you create like your sphere region, which is kind of a circumgalactic medium, the projection plot for the column densities. And that has its own fixed resolution buffer, which we might remember hearing before. And that kind of inspired this idea of taking, each of these column densities we have already computed with YT to make these plots is basically the same thing as if we just generated a bunch of random sight lines from quasars. So you imagine you have a galaxy, there's a quasar somewhere behind it, you're seeing the absorption of the CGM through that. And you get a kind of science result that there's not much of a difference. So we wanted to ask the question, is metallicity kind of a reasonable assumption that it's solar? We need to build on YT and then this Trident library, the extension to that, to kind of try and relax that assumption but in using what we already had, that kind of inspired ways to answer that, which I think is kind of a fun feedback loop, right? Of the code you write says what science you do, says what codes you write and science you do.
Got it? I've forgotten all about that. And now I'm reminded of how quickly you did it.
And how wound too, I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah, actually.